I'm Elaine Wilson, and each week I bring a program for you that is based on the famous artist of the day. I try to discuss their life, I try to discuss their art, and I try to set everything in a historical position so that as I move through my lectures with you, I am hopefully building for you a better understanding of how some of these people are connected to each other, how their lives have intertwined, how they have studied with or learned from each other, and today's artist will be no exception. The artist today is a Spanish artist named El Greco. He will be the artist that I designate as being the one who painted the spirituality of Spain, because Spain was going through some very rough religious times during his life, and there was a very strong emphasis on trying to instill in people, in believers, the importance of the stories in the Bible and the messages that were being delivered through that. So I will be using the spirituality end of Spain's life during the 1600s when he was alive, but I will also be pointing out to you a lot of things about the characteristics of his work that make him not only totally unique, but actually really quite of a master. So let's take a look at your artist of the day, El Greco. His name was actually Domenico Theotokopoulos, and his nickname that the Spaniards gave him was El Greco. Domenico Theotokopoulos was a Greek painter. He was not Spanish. He was Greek by birth. He was born in Crete. He will be a sculptor and he will be an architect. And I underline the word painter because in the time allotment I have, I am going to focus on his painting. But if you're curious about his architecture or sculpture, please feel free to pursue that interest. As I mentioned, he was born in Crete near Candia, and his family was a family who made their living and did quite well with painting miniature icons. So he was trained in that field. And he will be there until he's 26 years of age. And then he decides, because Crete is a political part of Venice at that time in history, he will go to Venice and he will study there because it is certainly a large center for great artists. I have talked to you before, and I will be mentioning again today artists like Titian and Tintoretto. They were Venetian artists. But he will spend time in Venice, and then he will go on to Rome. And I will discuss with you what happens to him in Rome and why he ends up being classified as a Spanish artist as we go through this. But when he is in Venice, he has the opportunity to work with the great older gentleman now, Titian. And remember, Titian is the one who, after several days, said that when Tintoretto was assigned to him as a young apprentice, that he couldn't teach him anything and Tintoretto had to leave. Tintoretto will be closer to the age of El Greco than, of course, Titian. Titian will die during El Greco's lifetime, but he will learn great things from them. After he leaves Rome, which will be his next stop, he goes to Madrid to work, and he works for Philip II. That doesn't turn out too well for him, but I'll give you that story when it's time. And finally, he moves on to Toledo. In today's world, Toledo is about a half an hour's train ride from Madrid, so it wasn't that long a journey for him. And Toledo was also a very big spiritual religious center of Spain at that time. And it will become not only his adopted city, but Spain will become his adopted country. While he is in Venice, he does this painting. And like many of the other artists that I have discussed with you, he doesn't do the painting just once and done. He will do it a number of different times. And I'll show you some that he does later after he leaves Venice and he is in Toledo. But in this one, take a look at what he's learning. Titian was famous for his wonderful colors, and look at the colors, not only in this painting that El Greco does, but also in all of the ones that are coming up. And then if you remember when we studied Tintoretto, Tintorettos love to take figures and twist them and turn them. And look, this man is sitting one way and he is turned and he's looking the other direction. These artists, both Titian and Tintoretto, were strong influences on El Greco. Tintoretto was also famous for his amazing backgrounds, if you can remember. And if you forget some of this, remember my lectures are all on YouTube, so you can review them at your leisure. But look at the distance here. It wasn't just satisfying him enough to show the outside, but he's showing way back this hallway as well. There are many things in this picture that are fascinating, and I could spend a lot of time on it, but we don't have that kind of time, and I want to get to Rome. He causes quite an upheaval in Rome. He doesn't really mean to, but on the screen right now you can see this wonderful Last Judgment painting on the wall of the Sistine Chapel that was done by Michelangelo, who has died by the time El Greco gets to Rome. And then you see over here an example of a piece that El Greco will do many years later when he's living in Spain. They are not alike, just as one example, and I will be coming back to El Greco's work later to discuss more about it. But take a look at the two figures of Christ. Michelangelo's figures were masculine, massive. Even the women had muscles, and they were thick and they were full. And El Greco's work is light and alive and slender. I don't remember really ever seeing very many pictures that he did of anybody where the person was even could be classified as portly. Another thing that's a characteristic of El Greco's work, and I point these things, these characteristics out to you as we go along, and then pretty much assume that you're going to remember them. El Greco will do earth and heaven. Notice in this piece, this is more like the work of Titian. The swirling and twisting and everything that's going on up here is more like Tintoretto. So from those two men, when he was in Venice, he learned a great deal. He wanted to see the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, and he had connections, and so a cardinal took him there. And the Pope was there. And as they walked into the chapel and El Greco looked at the Last Judgment for the first time, he said, well, he was a good man, but he didn't know how to paint. And if you would just whitewash over that wall, I'll paint something for you that will be much, much better. Well, guess what? At that time in history, Rome was a small village classified as a big city, and the news got out fast, and the Romans started calling him a foolish foreigner. And although he had set up his own little shop and was trying to work with two assistants to work on icons, he really finally had to close it up, and he found out that Philip II in Spain was looking for some new artists, and so he wisely moved on. When he gets to Spain, one of his early encounters is with this lovely woman in the fur wrap. She will end up being his significant other until he dies. She is the mother of their only son, Jorge. The wife that he left in Crete, he left in Crete. So he honored the commitment and did not marry again, but he did not go back to Crete, nor to the woman. Jeremina loved her fur, and she wore it with a great deal of pride. Notice her face especially, because she will show up in many of his paintings. And sometimes in his paintings, if there are several women, they will all look exactly alike. And it's because he has used Jeremina as his model for all of them. Here's their son. Jorge Manuel Theotokopoulos became an artist like his father. And this painting that El Greco did of him as a young man was done in this 5-year period. Notice that he shows Jorge holding the brushes, which are the brushes of his trade. And also notice that he has dressed Jorge in the style of the times. Spain was feeling affluent, and they could afford, they felt the wealthiness of these frivolous collars and cuffs that the men all wore. This was their style of dress. That will change with other artists, but during the time of El Greco, it's what was really worn by anybody important. Artists in the future, and I'll be discussing Picasso with you in November. And I will not be showing you this painting of his again because there's so many other ones to cover. But Picasso admired El Greco a great deal, and he did takeoffs on paintings, giving the attributes. He called it the portrait of Jorge Manuel Theotokopoulos by Picasso. So he gave credit to the original artist. But now, as you've looked at this for a minute, notice that he's included the palette. And you can see his thumb sticking through the palette. Notice that he's included the ruff around Jorge's neck. And also notice that the hand holding the brush with the little finger sticking out is over there too. Sometimes when people look at the work of Picasso, they get so overwhelmed with the abstractness of it that they forget to realize that there actually is reality included. And yes, his face is kind of mixed up. This ear on his right side can't be seen. But there's his nose, there's an eye, and this wonderful line work that Picasso was so famous for. He's interpreted that with Jorge as well. This is one of the early paintings that El Greco did when he got to Spain. And he will do 6 portraits early on, and they will establish him. They establish him not only as a portrait artist to be sought after, and he makes a great deal of money doing that, but he will also, for history's sake, he will immortalize many of the Spanish people in Toledo, and in Toledo when a visitor comes from another country, and I'll show you a painting of one of those. Now, when you look at this piece, you'll see that the proportions on this figure are relatively correct. And if you remember back to the painting that I showed opposite of Michelangelo's Last Judgment, the figures were twisted and turned, and they were elongated. Well, artists over the history of time have all suffered from being overly studied by people from other times, and people from other times seeing the work of El Greco, and not this piece, but the pieces that will follow it, that he had astigmatism, or he had something wrong with his vision, that he couldn't see, and therefore he elongated figures and he made things smaller than they should be. And folks, I'm offering this to you as an idea, but I'm really not offering you that as a fact, because look, he's in proportion, he's in scale. This was done when he first got there to Toledo. He will change as he goes along. Here's one of his first commission pieces that he does for a church. It's called The Assumption of the Virgin. And in this piece, you can see what I've already pointed out to you before. You have earth and you have heaven. You also have the Virgin Mary being assumed into heaven on the sliver of a moon. One of the fun things about looking at the work of El Greco, it's really a study in seeing what you can find, because there are so many small vignettes scattered throughout his work. But there is the dividing line between heaven and earth. And also notice, if I forget to mention it again, when he does this, he will usually do something to draw your eye up to the upper level. This isn't floating by itself. This is an intentional part of her robe. He learned from Titian. He learned from Tintoretto. Here we have the work of Titian at the bottom. Figures are fairly in scale, and they are logically positioned and in close quarters, as Titian was quite a master at doing. And then you see Tintoretto and the flowing lines and the flowing robes and starting to elongate the figures and just changing things subtly, and this will become the technique that some of the techniques that we recognize as being the work of El Greco. Okay, Philip II wanted him there because he knew he was a good artist and he had a lot of talent. And so when he got to Madrid, Philip II favorite saint was the man the arrow was pointing to. This is Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice was a Christian soldier who was executed by the infidels who wanted to get rid of Christianity, and all of his soldiers were killed. But this soldier was a gallant man and Philip's favorite. Philip does not like this piece, and I'll explain why. He thought these twisted figures, which he'd started to incorporate on a regular basis, were ugly. He did not see where this showed any sign of Maurice being brave. And so if you notice, Maurice is standing there, but he doesn't look brave. He just looks like he's having a conversation with somebody. Now, what else is going on in this piece that could have upset King Philip? Well, one of the things is that he recognized these people because they were all people who were citizens. El Greco will do his own figures, but he will use often, or more often than not, the faces of people that he came to know. He became quite well off during his time in Toledo, and he will have large parties. He'll hire musicians to walk around strolling on playing their instruments and strolling around the table while they ate. He had a very, very good clientele and a very, very intelligent and literary and knowledgeable circle of friends. So he includes them in the painting, and the king does not like that. Now back here are some of his men, and they're being decimated. So they count off by tens, and every 10th person is brought up to the front, and if you haven't noticed, there's a head laying there, and the body beside it is headless. And if you notice, the next guy in line is this one, who's saying his final prayers because he's going to be executed next. And this activity occurred until Maurice was the only one left, and then they executed him. If you look up in the sky and notice that this time it's not a division that is horizontal, but it's a division that is vertical, or that is angular. And you'll notice that that arrow is pointing to the angel who is recording the names of all of those who have died for their faith. So the sky, again, is filled with many interesting things besides the one that I've just pointed out. But in this piece, when it was finished, Philip accepted it, but it was supposed to hang in a glorious part of his main church. And he relegated it to an obscure chapel wall someplace else because he really did not like it. And this will eliminate El Greco's chance of becoming the painter for Philip. I have put an arrow or a box over here, and I want you to notice this because whether I mention it or not, if you look around in the paintings that I'm going to show you, you'll often see that there's a little white card someplace, and on that card will be the initials DT, Dominicos Thinokopoulos. He signed his work with his given name. He was Greek Orthodox by birth and practiced, of course, Catholicism when he is in Spain. And you'll notice that the serpent, which is crawling out from underneath this rock, is holding the sign. He enjoyed sticking his name in interesting places into his paintings. This is another one that he does early on, and this is about St. Martin of Tours. I don't know if you know about St. Martin or not, but St. Martin was a soldier who came upon a beggar, and the beggar had no cloak. And so here you see the arrow pointing to the sword that St. Martin is using to cut his cloak apart so he can give something to this beggar to wear to keep him warm. Later, as the story goes, St. Martin will have a dream, and the beggar will show up in his dream as the figure of Christ, wearing the green cloth, wearing the cloak. Now, all of this took place in Rheims, in France. But if you notice, the city of Toledo is in the background. The city of Toledo is going to be in the background more often than not. Why? Because that's what he wanted to do. He did not want to show Rheims. He wanted to show what he loved, along with what the person who had commissioned this piece for him had wanted. Now, you'll notice in this one that the proportions don't match, and I'll offer you a short list in just a minute. So if they don't matter to him, what does? Grace matters to him. The smoothness, the fluidness of the forms, that mattered to him. It didn't matter that their torsos were too long or that their feet were too small. It didn't matter to him about either one of those things or the fact that the heads on figures that are that large would be that small. And it also didn't matter to him that you might find that the fingers on some of the figures, look at this one, were excessively long. Now, why does he do this? Well, he decides that he has to learn from Titian and Tintoretto, his masters, but he has to be different from them in order to be successful. And down through history, they have come to call his style of painting Mannerist. And the reason for that? Because it is not like anything anybody else had done before him. It's not. Look at it. And it's not going to be like anything like anybody else has done after him. Here's a portrait that he does of a cardinal who visited Toledo. This cardinal was quite a character. He ordered that, some books say 250 and another book said 500, so I say he ordered about 400 people burned at the stake. And if you look at him, he's looking off to the side. He's being very cautious about something. And El Greco knows all this, and he's going to do the portrait because it's been commissioned, but it's not as flattering as certainly the cardinal had hoped. And although it was made to hang over his tomb, it never made that position. Now, where have you seen this before? When I discussed Mary Cassatt with you, I told you that her good friend Louisa Havemeyer here in the States had asked Mary to get some important paintings for her and her husband's collection. And Mary Cassatt said that she would be glad to do that, but that she would have to do some traveling. And so finally she said to Louisa, I can go to Spain. They're going to be showing some of El Greco's work. Maybe I can pick something up for you there. So she picked up this piece, and she had it shipped to the United States. And if you recall, when I talked about it, I said, Louise opened it up and she was fine with it. Her husband hated it. Why? Because he'd never seen anybody wearing a pair of glasses. And that's what upset him. And this man definitely has glasses on. And he's also kind of leering as he looks out of them. But you'll also notice at the bottom of this piece, he's given this tall man these little tiny shoes. And guess what, folks? He put his own name at the bottom. He signed his name right there in the paper at the foot of the cardinal. At the time that he did this piece, there were not landscape paintings being done. This was in what is called the View and Plan of Toledo. It's a rough piece. I couldn't find a good one to show you, so I'm going to his second one. And this is also a scene, but it is called Toledo. It's not the View and Plan. However, that's what his adopted city looked like to him. He only ever painted 2 landscapes. Why? Because people weren't commissioning those. And his time had to be spent on paintings that were going to bring to him a lucrative lifestyle. Now notice the swirling in this piece. He doesn't separate heaven and earth, but he does do wonderful dramatic things with the sky. And here's the Council of Trent, that it had interfered, and that's what part of the problem was with no landscapes. During this time period, the Council of Trent had said, no landscape painting, only faith-based paintings or paintings of portraits or paintings of royalty, but no landscapes. So this is the first one. In his landscape paintings of Toledo, which he will then incorporate into the backgrounds, just as a way to kind of get it in there again, you often see the Tongass River flowing through, because it does flow through along the side. And the city of Toledo is up on top of a hill. Now, are all the Escorial and all of the other buildings logically arranged in this painting? No. They're arranged so that you can see them and you can identify with that city. And to give you some sense of proportion, there are little tiny people walking along here to go across this bridge to mount the hill to get into the city. I think it's a wonderful piece. I wish she had done more landscapes. When I was in Florence, I was in the Uffizi Gallery, and they are honored to have one of ancient histories from the Greco-Roman period, one of ancient history's great sculptures of Laocoon and his sons. Laocoon is the one who lived in the city of Troy as a priest. And he was forewarned that the Trojan horse was being built and that the men would climb into the horse and they would go and attack another city. The gods had planned things that way, and so when they realized that Laocoon was on his way to tell the city that they were about to be laid siege, the gods sent huge serpents across the ground that found Laocoon and his 2 sons. And at the time this was done, size meant age. It's the older one, here's the older son, and here is the younger son. And you can actually see the serpent biting into the skin on the sculpture. Well, El Greco is very interested in this, but it will be the story that he portrays in this painting, but it's the only classical piece that he does. He doesn't do any others of these. But notice here, there's the horse going back towards the city. You can see the father. One son is already dead, and the other one soon will be. And then notice over here on this side, the woman has 2 heads. Notice down here, she has a bunch of feet and legs. Where are the 2 that are supposed to connect to her? How did this happen? Well, for a long, long time, there was no evidence of this head and part of this business down in here. But the painting had gotten very dark and they decided they needed to clean it. And when they cleaned it, lo and behold, they found that this figure, who is now looking away from the disaster about to happen, actually had been shown in the earliest work that he planned, facing that. And as far as this is concerned, he hadn't made up his mind. And so he just, when he wanted to overpaint, he just did. And when they cleaned, they said, oh, this is great for history. We'll just let it go. And what is the city back here? You guessed it. That's Toledo. This is the painting that is considered to be his masterpiece. This is a huge, huge painting, and it's done of this man, Count de Orga, right here, who had died 300 years before this painting by El Greco was done. He willed to the city of Toledo a great deal of money for his church, and it was endowed so that they continued to get the money all the time, and at one point they decided they wanted to use that money to recognize him and his great charity. So they hired El Greco to do this painting. So he does this Count de Orga, and of course he doesn't know what he looks like, but here he is, and he shows him as a soldier for Christ wearing the armor. And then he brings in, because history had said that St. Stephen and St. Augustine had come to lift him to heaven, into his tomb, but then to take his soul onto heaven. So he includes them in all of El Greco's background in detail work. Is just magnificently, this is in the Prado, and I have seen the original. These are miniature paintings. I mean, it's just amazing what he was capable of doing with the paintbrush. There's this figure of Christ that I mentioned to you before, but down below you can see John the Baptist. And over on the other side, first of all, you see Peter with the keys dangling, the keys to heaven, and in front of Peter is the Virgin Mary, and both of them are on either side of Christ. The whole picture is full of just magical things. I'm only pointing out a couple to you, but notice this one. Here you have three greats from biblical history. You have David, you have Noah, and you have Moses. Over here, on the earth side of this, the contemporary side, that man that I just circled is El Greco's very, very good friend and a literary giant, a poet, a writer, a very good friend of El Greco's. And here is another saint coming in to observe this important event. And I don't know if you've noticed yet or not, but you don't want to forget to see this little guy. This is Jorge Manuel. And Jorge is pointing to Count de Orga. And if you notice, Jorge has a triangular shaped hanky coming out of his pocket. Yep, you guessed it. That's where DT is signed and the birth date of the child. And he included the faces of people who were important at the time that the painting was done. And in fact, he included himself. And just to make sure that you're taking all of this in, he's looking directly at you. And also to help you understand the entire story and the balance here that we have between heaven and earth and pulling up, and there are other things that pull up to bring your eye up into this area. This angel is carrying the soul of Count de Orga. Connections again, and you'll see it over and over again, between Titian's earth scenes and Tintoretto's heaven-like paintings it's just amazing. I'm going to show you two paintings at once, and I'm just going to give you a list of a couple of things to look for. On the left, God is on the throne, and on the right, God is lifting Jesus. This is at the baptism, and this is after the crucifixion. Also notice that in each one of the pieces, if you look, you can see the Holy Spirit, which is not really a dove, but is symbolically shown as a dove in painting, so you get the idea, and don't forget that he's part of the 3 and 1. So you have the dove there. And over here, of course, you have John the Baptist again, and this time he is anointing Christ's head because he is baptizing him. There's El Greco's signature. Over here, angels are raising Christ's body, which has been crucified. You can see the wound in his side, you can see the nail hole on his foot, and underneath the cape of God on either side, there are small angels that are not only observing this wondrous time, but also helping to hold back the cape of God as he lifts Christ heavenward. I'm going to show you 2 of these scenes. He did this again. He did many paintings over and over. People would request them. They'd see somebody had one and they wanted one for themselves. This one is around the theme of Christ healing the blind man. The blind man had been blind since birth. He had not ever seen. And Christ is touching his eyes and opens his eyes so that he can see. In the next painting that I show you as a counterpart to this, you'll see these 2 figures again. But you'll notice that they are a different scale. In the next painting, you'll also see this figure again, but in a different scale. But in the next painting, you will not see the dog or the bags, because here's what happens. In the next painting that he does this, and this one was never finished. Now we have the parents of their son, who is, now he's going to be able to see, and they are just amazed with this. Over to the right of Christ, but to your left, there's a figure here. That figure is not finished. That figure is done in sepia tones, and he never got around to finishing that figure, or some other parts of the painting as well. But that figure is leaning down. It's a figure of a woman, and she is leaning down. This is the top of her head, and her eyes are in here, leaning down to see this joyous moment. There are the 2 figures I pointed out to you before. They were sitting on the steps. Now the steps have been moved back in space further than they were before. And this figure also, sepia tone. It was not finished. But you'll notice the sky is dramatic, and there are lots of parts yet that are left unfinished. But if you look at these, you'll see that he's using the colors of Titian, and he's using the perspective of Tintoretto. And because he had studied with Tintoretto, he knew that he could make clay figures. And that's why I said he would often do his own figures, but then he would use the heads of people that he knew in the community in the painting. So he adopted that special technique of working from models from his time in Venice with Tintoretto. These 2 paintings have similar backgrounds in that their skies are very turbulent, and in both cases the figures are twisting and turning, and of course you're working with clay models, you can easily do that, and the perspective gets deeper and deeper. It's deep here, but it goes back further here, yet these buildings are larger. He wouldn't copy himself exactly, but he did love to use brilliant colors with his work. Here's one that he did that I showed you earlier. Your eyes aren't deceiving you. This one is called Christ Driving the Traders from the Temple, and this was done when he was in Venice. Now he is in Spain. And look what he does. Christ driving the traders from the temple. This time you see Christ is holding a whip, and he is about to hit this guy. And this woman can't believe what's going on. I don't know what he's doing down here in the corner. This one is having some kind of a conversation over here. There's so much activity in this piece. And this man who's leaning down, you're going to see that posture, not that exact position, But you'll see this posture again, and clearly it was one of his clay figures that he used for that. And would the clay figures be modeled to normal sizes? Yes, probably. But were they elongated in his paintings? Well, absolutely, you can see that. This is one that also caused some trouble for him, and he didn't get a full payment for it, and that caused him some trouble too because he ended up having to go to trial over it. But everything turned out all right in the end. This is called the disrobing of Christ. The person wanted that scene painted. Now, first of all, notice that you're being watched. Do you see that man back there? He's pointing at Christ. He's looking at you. He's saying, this is all your fault. He is having to die for your sins. And that's what El Greco's message is with that man. What else is going on? Well, we have this man who is about to disrobe Christ. And if you notice, he's wrapped his hands around a rope, and he also has the other end of the rope attached to Christ's wrist, so he won't get away. Down here is one of those figures I just pointed out to you. But this time the man is doing something that we can understand, and that is that he's taking an awl and starting the hole that will be used to pound through the hand of Christ to hang him on the cross. One of the reasons, only one, but one of the reasons why this painting was disturbing to people was because it included the three Marys. And if you notice, the three Marys all look like Jeremina. But another reason that was a problem is that Christ is lower in the picture plane than all of this throng of people that are behind him. And that, according to them, did not honor Christ. This is the scale of this piece, so you can get an idea as to how large and how impressive it is. And it now hangs, of course, in Spain. Many of his paintings are very large, and only the smaller ones have been transportable or put up for auction, like the Cardinal and like some others as well. But this piece became a very famous, important piece to all of us down through history. But at the time, people looked at it with aghast because Christ is looking towards heaven. These men are all shuffling around and looking at him, and he's trying to take his robe off, and he's pointing at you or looking at you. It's quite an impressive piece. He did several of Agony in the Garden. In this one, you've got a lot of stuff going on. You have an angel, Peter, James the Great, and John, soldiers and Judas, and Toledo in the distance. And it doesn't look cluttered, but look what he does. There are actually 3 scenes in this piece, not just one. You have the angel bringing the chalice, and this is when Christ said, please, I'd soon not have that cup, please take it away from me. And of course that doesn't happen. But then you have another scene, and she's standing on top of this almost like a clamshell shape. And there is Peter, James the Great, and John sleeping. Christ had said to them, don't go to sleep. Stay awake, watch for me. What do? They all decided to take a nap. On the other side, there you have Judas approaching with the soldiers. So you've got all that activity over there. So you actually have 3 scenes, and you have 2 different types of skies. You have the bright glory of heaven, and you have a full moon, but yet the darkness of night. So you have good and evil up here represented again as a reminder. In another one that he did called Agony in the Garden, he changed things around a little bit, and he has 3 arenas of action in this piece. You'll see one over here, and you see the other 2 here. Now you're accustomed to what you're looking at this time, but one is a heavenly encounter, one is the earthly turmoil with the dark skies, and then the other one is just quiet restfulness. Now this time he has moved Peter James the Great and John to the front of the canvas, but they are separated from this scene and from this scene, but in such subtle ways. And again, the background, the light of heaven and the darkness of earth. This is an interesting piece because this doesn't show you where Christ is. This is one of his earlier works, and it is an earlier work, but he has already started to make the fingers extremely long. The eyes, he showed them glassy or teary-eyed, but in this kind they're glassy, and he's looking up towards heaven. And he's carrying the cross, which is what he dies on as a sacrifice to the children of God. There are no figures in this. There's no specific site in this, because this is what he hoped would be a universal statement. He did the figure of Christ many times because many people wanted it commissioned. I'm going to show you 4 of them. And the first thing I want you to notice is the halo. Again, he's a mannerist painting. He's not going to make a little round gold ring. He's not going to make a halo of light around him. He's decided he will make an angular shape because that had not been seen before. But if you notice, these are all the same person. And notice something else. The 2 on the left side have their hand or their arm resting on the globe of the world, the earth. And also notice something else. Christ's hand is up in not only this piece, but this piece. When you see this position in a sculpture, in relief sculpture, in a painting, in any of those things, be aware of the fact that that is the person in the scene that is speaking. That is the important person in the painting, the first important person. Others will be there. But in this case, Christ is speaking to you and looking directly at you. Here are 2 that he did of Christ, and I brought these along because I want you to notice it almost looks as though the cross is just lifting itself up into heaven. There's no foreground here. You can see at the bottom the bones from Calvary, and you can also see midway back the soldiers. They have left, they've done what they had to do, and they're on their way. And you can also see further back that he's showing the city of Toledo. That is not Jerusalem. But all of those factors are in both of these pieces. Now he does has a tendency here to treat the sky, it's kind of like a large X shape in both of these. But each one of these makes a different statement, so whoever had commissioned the piece got their own work, not an exact copy. You'll notice that this one, the figure of Christ, is fairly clean, and this one, blood is staining the cross as it runs down from his body. He did some women, not a lot, but he did do about 7 of these pieces of Mary Magdalene. We know it's Mary Magdalene because there's the jar of ointment that she carried to the tomb to anoint the body of Christ, and of course found the tomb empty. The skull, when it's included with Mary Magdalene, always signifies the transition of life, the transitory state of life, and the transition from life into heaven or life everlasting. Here you see it's in the dark, but you can see it if you look closely. There is her jar of ointment, and there is the skull again. As we know, there are, as I said to you, there are 7 of these. I've only picked out 2 of them, but they are, probably correctly I can say they are probably both the same woman. And if you notice the eyes again, as I pointed out in the figure of Christ, they're tearful. The sky is dark, especially over here in this one, needing you to remember that repentance is very important. This is the Annunciation, and he did several of these. And if you look at this piece, you'll see that the dove is there. You'll also see that heaven is over there. He's not included that in this one, but he does with that one. And you also notice that down here in the foreground, there is a vase waiting for the lilies that the angel Gabriel is going to bring down to make as he makes the announcement to Mary that she will be giving birth to God's child. To prove or to remind people that Mary was human and not otherworldly, her sewing is laying there on the floor, and she has a book that she's been reading, and she's holding the place with her hand. Here are two interesting pieces that he does around the same time. This one is the Holy Family. You can see Joseph and Mary and the baby, and Mary's mother Anne, and John the Baptist, who was born before his cousin Jesus. And over here, you see two saints, Martina and Agnes. And this piece is another one of those where heaven and earth connect through this area. But on the head of the lion, now, Martina was able to calm the lion, but on the head, and her hand is resting on it, but on the head of the lion are the initials D.T. And Agnes is holding a lamb because it is said that she came back to people, and when she came as gentle as a lamb. So he has her holding that. Many things, again, time is too short to go into, but many things happening in these pieces. This piece and the next one I'm going to show you that represents his interpretation of the repentant Peter are just lovely, lovely pieces. The other one I'll show you a little larger, but you'll see the same things. You'll see the vine, you'll see Peter, and you'll see a figure back here. Here's the painting. There's the vine, there's Peter, and then there's their figure in the background. Okay, Peter is looking heavenward, and this time the shiny part are the tears in his eyes. You'll also notice that at his belt are the keys to the kingdom. And you might know this if you're Catholic. I'm not, so I didn't know it. Every pope is buried with his own set of keys. That happens even today. And there are the tears of remorse, because Peter said at the Last Supper that he would never betray his follower Jesus, or his leader Jesus, and Jesus said, "You'll, before the cock crows 3 times, you'll have denied me." And Peter goes, "Oh, no, that can't happen." And well, of course, it does, in fact, happen. So what is this painting about? Well, it's painting of Peter's remorse, but back here, this figure is Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene at that time in history represented sinning, and Peter represented denial. So here you have the sinner and the denier. Whenever you look at art, you are looking not only at a painting, but you are looking at visual literature. Paintings will tell you stories, stories that enrich your life and educate you beyond many things that you could find in a book. This is an important piece because it's the last, really, pretty much the last piece that El Greco does before he dies. And we have, again, characteristically, we have earth and we have heaven. And it is classified as his last major work, and one of the reasons for this is because he had done this himself. This was not a commissioned piece, and this was designed to hang over his tomb. And this figure is supposedly an image of him as an older man. He dies at the age of 73. You'll notice that the light coming into this piece is all radiating from the figure of the child on the lap of Mary. All the light in that painting comes from there. Everything behind that is dark. And the angels, of course, are singing. And it's really a very strong, mannerous piece. Look at the distortion of proportion in these pieces. Nobody this tall could stand on feet that little. This is a technique that El Greco used. He recorded the spirituality of Spain, as I said at the onset, and he did that at a time that was critical for people to renew their faith and their understanding of their relationship to their God. After he dies, his work will not be well received, and it will come clear to the 19th century. And of course, then we have the time of Picasso and Dali, and you'll see some others who recognize his work and esteem it. But it will come through a very, very dark period. But at the time that he does this, and until the time that he dies, he is a highly successful, well sought after Spanish artist. There is a self-portrait of him, and there is his name as he would write it. There's Dominicos Theotokopoulos, and often it would say down in this area the date, or it would say made by me, or made this. But he died in 1614. He'd been out to dinner with some friends, and they'd had a wonderful time, and he came back to his home, and he got extremely ill, and within 1 month, he was dead. Now, when he died, he left 3 apartments. He had become affluent enough that he owned 3. He had his home, and next to that, his sales painting storage area, and then another one, which was his studio. In this month-long period, he realizes that the end is coming, and so he calls his son to his side, and a new will is set for him so that everything that belongs to him will automatically transfer to his son, who can then continue to work in the studio and complete some of the pieces that he had started. His son will continue. He's not a success, but certainly his talents do not match those of his father. In many cases, he works on, or he had worked on, the paintings of his father that he had started, but in many cases, just for Jorge Manuel to do his own, he was not as good. Where do they bury El Greco? He never went back to Crete. He never went back to find out what happened to his first wife. He stays in Toledo, and that's where he's buried. And one of the things that he said that I thought would be nice to offer to you is this: I paint because the spirits whisper madly inside my head. He's a wonderful, great Spanish artist who brought to all of us the spirituality of the time and place that he lived in and the country that he lived in, which was Spain. If you have any questions about this particular presentation, please don't hesitate to be in touch with the Willow Valley website, Ask Presenter, and I put that up on the screen for you now. So if there are any questions? No questions. Well, again, I sort of think that I did okay. If I have not made you confused, I haven't confused you, but at the same time, I've perhaps opened up some new arenas for you to consider. And as I said earlier, when it comes to the comments that I make, like today, about Mary Cassatt, about Titian, about Tintoretto, you're not left hanging. All of those are available in YouTube, and you can see them. If you go to the Willow Valley website and look for Elaine Wilson lectures, you'll find all of them listed there. And so you can do a quick review anytime that you might want to, or anytime you need to prove a point to somebody who might not think the same way you do, and you're giving them some new avenues to consider. Next week, I will be discussing an artist called Velázquez. And Velázquez will do this piece that you see right here. Velázquez's paintings are very different from El Greco's. And Velázquez, I'm going to say that Velázquez painted the nobility of Spain. He recorded with his brush what the people of Spain really looked like at that time. No elongations, no small feet and long fingers, no little heads. He is a master with the brush, just as his counterpart, El Greco, but in a very different way. This is one of his popular pieces called The Water Cellar, but I will show you a lot of paintings that will give you an idea as to what the nobility was like and how they lived during the time of this great master. If you want an advance copy of that handout on El Greco, please don't hesitate to get in touch with Ask Presenter at willowvalley.org, and something will be clicked out to you very quickly. In the meantime, I'll prepare to come next Tuesday and speak to you about Velázquez. And I hope in the meantime you'll consider getting a handout. It's not going to be all the same information that I share. And it's not always exactly the same information, as I said last week, that's in the advertisement about the upcoming lecture. I am trying to expand your horizons, not close them. And so what I'm trying to do is to build on what I know you know or have been exposed to, and then enhance that or add to it. So on the sheet for Velázquez, there are some questions, just as there were with El Greco, and there are two of his famous paintings included. And I think that next week, having understood El Greco, that you'll find Velázquez to be quite an interesting man. He does become the court painter, but even that story is kind of fun. So I always love to come and spend time with you. Thank you very much. Please come back next week. Stay well in the meantime, and be as happy as you can be every single day. Thank you. Bye-bye.